There is a place on Earth where the sun disappears for months at a time, where the temperature can drop low enough to freeze exposed skin in under a minute, where the only food for hundreds of miles is pulled from the ocean through a hole cut in ice. A place where human survival should not have been possible at all, and yet people have lived there continuously for thousands of years. But here is what the genetic data has now forced us to confront. The people living there today are not the first. They may not even be the second. And the civilization that came before them, that endured that same darkness, that same cold, for 3,500 years, vanished so completely that they left almost no trace in any living human body on Earth. The data doesn't show one migration into the Arctic. It shows a replacement. And what replaced the original people, and why, is the question that genomics has only just begun to make possible, and has not yet been able to answer. For most of the last century, the story of how the Arctic came to be inhabited was told with satisfying clarity. The Inuit people, the community spread from Alaska across Arctic Canada and into Greenland, descend from the Thule culture. The Thule were a maritime people who emerged in northern Alaska somewhere around 1000 CE and expanded eastward with extraordinary speed, crossing the entire breadth of Arctic North America within roughly 200 years. They were technological pioneers. The kayak as we understand it, the toggling harpoon, designed to pivot inside a whale's body and prevent escape, the dog sled, capable of covering enormous distances across sea ice. These were not small advantages. They were the difference between starvation and abundance, between freezing and survival. The Inuit Yupik language family, which stretches from Siberia across Alaska and Canada all the way to Greenland, shows remarkably little divergence for its geographic span, a linguistic fingerprint consistent with exactly this kind of rapid, recent population expansion. Languages that spread slowly tend to fragment. This one stayed coherent. That coherence told researchers something important. The people who spread it moved fast. Before the Thule, the Arctic was inhabited by a different culture entirely, the Dorset people, a paleo Eskimo population who had been present in the Arctic since roughly 800 BCE. They had no dogs. Their hunting technology was simpler, but they had survived there for nearly 2,000 years before the Thule arrived, and then they were gone. The archaeology shows a pattern of replacement across the eastern Arctic. Thule artifacts appear, Dorset artifacts disappear, within a few generations. The mainstream account accepted this as the natural outcome of a technological contest. The better-equipped Thule people simply outcompeted the Dorset for resources, and the Dorset gradually died out. It was a clean story, expected, and it turns out to be wrong in ways that should trouble us deeply. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2014, a team led by Manasa Raghavan published a landmark study in the journal Science, The Genetic Prehistory of the New World Arctic, in which researchers analyzed ancient DNA from 169 ancient and modern individuals across the Arctic. What they found was not what the clean story would predict. When researchers compared the ancient DNA of Dorset individuals, the people who had lived in the Arctic for thousands of years before the Thule arrived, with the DNA of modern Inuit populations, they found something that defied the standard model of replacement. The Dorset had left virtually no genetic signature in any modern Arctic people. Not a few percent, not a marginal trace, essentially nothing. Think about what that means. A haplogroup, in simplest terms, it is like a surname written not in a family Bible, but in the body itself, passed through generations in our mitochondrial DNA or our Y chromosomes. These signatures persist, even when populations are conquered, even when they are marginalized, even when cultures are suppressed and languages die. The biological record usually survives some mixing, some admixture, some trace. The Dorset left none. And there was a second anomaly layered beneath the first. Modern Inuit populations carry distinctive mitochondrial haplogroup patterns, specifically within the A2 and D subclades, the maternal lineages passed from mother to child, that diverge in unexpected ways from Siberian Yupik populations, which should be among their closest genetic relatives. The maternal lineage story is not a simple eastward march from Siberia to Greenland. There are frequency distributions that don't fit a single clean origin. The picture is more complex than the accepted model ever suggested. Ancient DNA from pre-thule Arctic individuals, when placed against modern family trees of human migration, formed a cluster so genetically distinct that researchers initially struggled to situate it within any existing framework. These were not a branch of the same tree as modern Inuit. They were a different tree entirely, not related, not distant, separate. The first theory, the one most researchers reach for, is competitive replacement. The thule arrived with dogs. The Dorset had none. The thule hunted bowhead whales in open water. The Dorset worked with smaller prey, smaller tools, smaller social groups. And crucially, the thule arrived around 1000 CE, during what climatologists call the medieval warm period, roughly 900 to 1200 CE, a phase of relative warming that shifted sea ice patterns, opened migration routes, and redistributed the prey species that Arctic populations depended on entirely. Population modeling studies have shown that even a modest survival or reproductive advantage per generation, something as small as 2 or 3 percentage points, can produce total demographic replacement within 5 to 6 centuries without any direct conflict whatsoever. No war required. Just an edge, sustained across enough generations in the brutal arithmetic of Arctic survival. This theory is coherent. It is supported by the chronology. It explains the disappearance of the Dorset in the archaeological record with a mechanism that requires no extraordinary assumptions. But it does not explain the genetics. Competitive displacement, even complete competitive displacement, does not typically produce zero genetic mixing. When populations share territory for even a few generations, there is usually admixture. Children are born. Lineages blend. The biological record of contact almost always leaves a smear across the DNA record. Here, there is no smear. The Raghavan study found that modern Inuit derive their ancestry overwhelmingly from thule forebears, with a Dorset genetic contribution that researchers describe as negligible or absent. The theory explains the disappearance. It cannot explain the absence. The second theory is more complicated, and for many researchers, more uncomfortable. Some geneticists now argue that the paleo-Eskimo, Dorset, and neo-Eskimo, Thule and their Inuit descendants, lineages, do not represent a single human story of migration and replacement at all. Instead, they represent two entirely independent migrations out of Siberia, separated by thousands of years, who happen to occupy the same vast landscape without ever meaningfully intermingling. The ancient DNA evidence places the paleo-Eskimo migration, the ancestors of the Dorset, at approximately 4,500 years before the present. The neo-Eskimo migration that eventually produced the Thule culture and modern Inuit populations occurred roughly 800 to 1,000 years ago. The gap between these two events is somewhere in the range of 3,500 to 4,000 years. For context, that is roughly the distance in time between us and ancient Egypt. Raghavan's 2014 science study supports this two-migration framework. The genetic distance between Dorset ancient DNA and modern Inuit DNA is not the distance you would expect between an ancestral population and its descendants. It is the distance between strangers. What this means, if it holds, is staggering. The Arctic was not one human story. It was two. Two completely independent experiments in cold climate survival. Two separate populations who found each other across 3,500 years of parallel existence on the same ice, and then one of them disappeared without leaving a single detectable descendant. This theory explains the genetic distance. It deepens, rather than resolves, the mystery of the disappearance. If these groups were truly so genetically distinct, if there were thousands of years of separation in their respective evolutionary histories, then the complete absence of Dorset DNA in modern Inuit genomes is not merely the predictable outcome of competition. It implies something more systematic, more deliberate, or more catastrophic. And here is the part most researchers are hesitant to say directly. The third possibility, treated carefully by those who raise it, and not formally endorsed by mainstream Arctic archaeology, is that the Dorset's disappearance was not passive. The genetic data shows near-zero admixture. The archaeological record shows not a gradual decline, but in some sites, an abrupt and total cessation. Dorset occupation layers end. Thule occupation layers begin. There is in some locations no mixing layer between them, as though a switch was flipped. Inuit oral traditions contain references to a people called the Tunit, the Inuit name for those who came before. In these accounts, the Tunit are described as large, physically powerful, passive. Some accounts describe them being driven away. Some describe them being destroyed. Researchers have noted, carefully, that these oral traditions are not historical documents. They are mythology, shaped by generations of retelling. They cannot be taken as literal accounts of events 1,000 years past. But neither can they be dismissed entirely. They are what survives when the biological record leaves nothing. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. The data doesn't confirm deliberate elimination. It only fails to rule it out. And perhaps that is the most honest statement the evidence currently permits. Something happened to the Dorset that produced a total genetic absence, and we do not yet understand what it was. Imagine you are standing on the coastline of Baffin Island, in the region archaeologists call Navy Board Inlet. The year is approximately 1100 CE. The ice beneath you has been walked on by Dorset hunters for more than 200 generations. The smell of rendered seal fat is carried on a wind so cold it burns the inside of your lungs with every breath. You are holding a bone needle, small, precisely made. A Dorset tool, recovered centuries later by archaeologists, dated to within 2 generations of the last known Dorset occupation of this coastline. The hands that made it learned from hands that had made the same object in the same way for 1,000 years before that. Somewhere to the west, across the ice, the thule are coming. You do not know this. No one on this coastline knows this. The wind that comes from that direction has a name in your language, a word that captures its specific quality, its season, its particular cold. Within your children's lifetime, there will be no one left who knows that word. The language will end. The name for the wind will end with it. You set down the needle. The ice holds it. And then the centuries pass, and the needle stays, and the people do not. Here is the twist the DNA makes possible. The Inuit, the people living in the Arctic today, are among the most remarkable examples of human biological adaptation on record. They thrive in conditions that should be physiologically impossible for most people. And for years, researchers assumed this was because they were the inheritors of thousands of years of Arctic adaptation, built up gradually through the Dorset and their ancestors, passed down through generations of cold climate survival. The genetic data says otherwise. A 2015 study published in Nature by Fumagalli and colleagues identified unique variants in a gene called CPT1A, a gene that regulates how the body processes fatty acids, essentially how it converts fat into energy, present in Greenlandic Inuit populations at frequencies of roughly 68%. These variants appear to be directly adaptive for a diet composed almost entirely of fat and protein, with virtually no carbohydrates. They are largely absent in Siberian Yupik populations, and they were not present at comparable frequencies in the ancient Dorset samples. CPT1A is like an engine modification, a rewrite of the body's fuel system to run on a different source. The Inuit body, as it exists today, was not inherited from the Arctic's first people. It was built independently, evolved fresh. After the Thule migration, after the Dorset were already gone. Modern Inuit did not inherit the Arctic. They reconquered it. They built their own biological toolkit for a world the Dorset had already spent 3,000 years learning to navigate, and they did it from scratch. The hidden migration in this story is double. The Thule migration that produced modern Inuit is well documented. The hidden one is the Dorset migration, the first crossing, 4,500 years ago, by people who walked into the coldest inhabited region on Earth and survived there for 35 centuries, and then disappeared so completely that for most of recorded history, no one knew they had existed at all. We found them only in the archive that cannot be forged or forgotten, the archive written into ancient bone, extracted in laboratories, read in sequences of code that the Dorset themselves would never have imagined. The Dorset are not unique in their erasure. Across the full sweep of human history, populations have been replaced, not just displaced from land, but erased from the genetic record, leaving no trace in the bodies of the people who came after them. What makes the Dorset singular is that they are the first group for whom we have been able to confirm this with the precision of ancient DNA analysis. They are the first ghost people for whom we have proof. They will not be the last we find. What does it mean to be indigenous to a place if the people who lived there for 3,500 years left no living descendants? What does first even mean when the genetic record keeps pushing that answer further and further into the past, revealing civilization beneath civilization, people beneath people, each one more invisible than the last? The ice holds things: needles, seeds, fragments of bone, a wind with a name that no one remembers. The Inuit were never what we thought, and the people they replaced, the first people of the Arctic, were never remembered at all, until the DNA found them, waiting in the cold, exactly where they had always been.